privately held competitors and various people who either work there currently or previously. We spoke to several auto industry consultants, so those are consultants to the actual operating businesses rather than financial investors. We spoke to some of ex-management, and we spoke to some of the clients, so the OEMs that actually buy these businesses, buy these parts from the steering company. So that's the kind of business we tend to do. That's the type of research we tend to do. So looking around the kind of value chain and speaking to people who are real industry participants.
And do you think that, would you ever invest in a great business where where there hasn't been a material drawdown valuation?
So I certainly have in the past. They haven't been wildly successful investments. So I try to restrain myself a little bit. But I mean, look, never say never. I mean, I guess the starting point for how I think about whether to invest in businesses is the upside versus the downside. And there are many great businesses that have not seen a derating where you can still make quite a compelling case that intrinsic value is meaningfully higher than the stock price. It's just that it becomes that much harder because you don't have various kind of behavioral issues providing you a tailwind. You actually have a bit of a headwind because everybody likes to extrapolate good results. So put it this way, I think it's a harder game to play and one that I haven't played as successfully. But I've definitely tried to participate in that, and definitely open to thinking about investment ideas like that in the future.
Arthur, my sense is that your current stock, because it has more of a value focus, there is a compulsion to look at those names which have fallen. Yeah. But also, you as an investor are quite attracted to both ways of investing. The fact you wouldn't mind doing sort of more straight compounders, for want of a better word, where the growth is strong enough that even though it hasn't fallen off, the market is fluctuating obviously. How do you manage both sides of the investment coin? Do you think you're only one or the other? Do you think people can only be one or the other? Or if you were to start looking more at straight compounders, how would you go about doing that without making mistakes because of your previous framework?
Yeah, well, so you're quite right. So my current shop is valuation biased, right? So I think that just makes it organizationally that much more challenging to go and argue for ideas that haven't derated, even though I have done that and successfully every once in a while here. Throughout my history, I've done both. I've made money and lost money on both. I think that there are different kind of sectors and different market environments and also different kind of countries that are just inherently more amenable to one or the other. And I think by way of example, developed Asian markets, well, I guess not within your remit, but in Singapore and Hong Kong, I think not that easy to find lots of great compounders and very easy to find lots of stocks that kind of, I guess, are rebounders when times get depressed and snap back. I think the rest of Asia is probably a little bit more compounder heavy in terms of great investment ideas. So your specific question was, well, so how would I go about kind of researching and investing in compounders given my history? Well, I think that if you don't start with a valuation bias, you have to start with some other kind of understanding of why valuation or pricing is, why there's likely to be mispricing, right? And I think that can be informational, but that's very hard in most markets to really have a real informational edge. I think it can be a kind of horizon-driven edge, in that, especially in Asia, we have very short-term investors, and there are some people that just cannot look beyond 24 months. So, by forcing yourself to take a longer investment horizon, that's one way. I think by spending a great deal of time, thinking about what could catalyze a revaluation, that's something else that you probably have to do with compounders that I've had, success with at times, and not so much success with in other occasions. So I can talk through some specific ideas, but I think overall framework is, so if you don't buy something because it's beaten down and you don't have that kind of behavioral tailwind, you better find some other tailwind, and that tailwind may be a long-term investment horizon.
compounds becoming automated deciders, but are there any overarching characteristics that you draw out in companies that you think can grow in a value-creating way for a long period of time?
Well, I think if you had to generalize and kind of think of the dream compounder, it would have a company that has high and stable or rising ROIC or another similar metric, and that has rational capital allocation with the money that's coming in, so that it's recycled in a value creation way. Both, and then I would define that as kind of testing by ROIC or by IRR any operating capex versus a buyback versus an M&A deal. And so that's kind of like optimal capital allocation in my view, and I think that that's necessary, and then I think having good economics to begin with is necessary.
And are there any sort of general qualitative characteristics of a business that you think allow and protect high ROIC?
Well, I'm not sure whether this is a good answer because it's kind of circular, but I would say generally a moat, right? I mean, so some type of reason why others can't replicate your business. So that could be sometimes it's scale driven. I mean, not often, but sometimes you just have the, I guess, advertising and promotion margin leverage or an R&D margin leverage. Namely, if you spend 10% on any one of these categories, you have a head start if you're 10 times bigger than anyone else. Often in Asia, they can be kind of regulatory or kind of first mover. So that the casino business in Malaysia, for instance, doesn't really have any kind of hard competitive advantage, but it's been there forever and bankrolled every politician in the country for 50 years. So that is a moat. I think beyond that, I'm not a great philosopher of this. I'm sure we could kind of think up other factors, just maybe kind of going through on a bottom-up basis, companies that I think have a great moat. Sometimes it's that kind of user base or, economies of density or, kind of network economics or, various things that make it hard for a newcomer to go and replicate the economics without a great deal of investment.
This is Anthony Linden, who's senior analyst and member of the large cap team.
Hi.
And is about to ask you an incisive question.
All right.
You like Nexteer, yeah?
Yes, I do.
How can you possibly tell that they have a technological edge or advantage over their peers when all of their peers are unlisted or deeply embedded within Korean, Japanese or European manufacturers? I know they do a very good tale of selling themselves.
Yeah.
He's one of the best IRs in Asia. But how do you prove they actually benefit for anything else apart from being a former GM parasite?
Yeah, well, I think, to start with, the thesis is not that they're like 3 times better in technology or 5 years ahead of everyone else. So that's not the starting point. The starting point is that there's industry consolidation and that they are probably marginally better in their target markets than the other 2 big guys, ZF, TRW, and Bosch. And that there won't really be a place in that market for the tail 20% of industry participants over the next 5 to 10 years because the technological sophistication and the amount of R&D that's needed to support EV and autonomous vehicles is just kind of rising. So that's the starting point. But so then to speak to how did I actually come to that view, paradoxically I find it's actually a lot easier to get good information about an industry where companies are unlisted than listed. I mean, with listed companies, there's a great deal of kind of reticence to, speak openly about prospects and, regulation FD in the U.S. and, just general kind of reticence. There's a cookie cutter message that these companies are deciding to give out, and you just go with that. I think with unlisted companies, we had no difficulty finding like 3 people from Bosch. I think think one or two from TRW and ZF to speak to us. We had no difficulty finding two industry consultants that consult to TRW and Bosch. We spoke to a former buyer of these components in BMW BMW buys globally, but he happened to be based in China, so he was able to speak most powerfully to how the products were, I guess, better priced or better value for money in China. So, it was just the standard scuttlebutt. Ask the competitors, ask the suppliers, ask the customers, and I don't think that that's more of a challenge for unlisted companies than it is for listed companies.
Why don't you think they are going to be in that tail? I mean, they are what number? I mean, they're okay in China, but globally they are 5, 6, after having gone backwards for a number of years.
Okay, so I mean, the market splits I've seen show them as, I think, a number 3 pushing on number 2. But we may be looking at different stats. So if you look at the smaller guys, right? So Mando is probably the biggest, right? So I mean the Koreans, based on what I've heard from experts, have simply stolen ZF TRW technology 20 years ago and have kind of refined it a little bit. And that's how it's marketed into the Chinese OEM space, and that's how it performs within the Korean OEMs. So in other words, they're further from steer-by-wire, which is, I guess, the newest form of technology within steering. And they haven't penetrated the high-margin rack steering that Nexteer participates in. And then there's also, I think, Showa and a few other kind of smaller Japanese guys. So the way that I see the industry is that you'll have TRW and ZF, you'll have Bosch, you'll have JTech. JTech is largely captive. And then if you look at the markets in which these guys participate, but to simplify, there's basically the US and China, right? So in the US, they have that position within GM, and they're making inroads within Ford. And they are also exposed to the fastest growing and highest margin bit of steering. And so I think just looking at what market share developments have been, it seems that position is relatively secure in the US. So in China, we spent a little bit more time because I found that to be a harder market to understand, and there's also more incremental growth there. So my understanding of the Chinese market is that Nexteer is very competitively positioned in terms of pricing versus Bosch especially, but also versus TRW ZF. And by very competitively, I mean they underpriced by 5% or more, which is quite significant there. They're also much more willing to, I guess, expedite R&D and the whole process a little bit Chinese style than the Bosch or the TRW guys are. So in other words, they're a more natural fit for the OEMs or the domestic OEMs within China. And then the rest comes down to what are some problems with JTech and what are some problems with TRW and Bosch in China. So Bosch has basically a JV, and everything has to go through this JV, and the JV is with Shanghai Auto, right? So in that sense, it's a little bit like Nexteer used to be in the US. I mean, if you're a captive, if you're owned by one automaker, you may not necessarily make the best inroads with everyone else. Bosch also has very high pricing. JTech, according to 2 or 3 people that we spoke to, has kind of cultural problems dealing with non-Japanese makers. And ZF TRW is competitive, but prices at a higher price. So I guess I've kind of blurted out a lot of specifics, but stepping back, if you see market share gains at stable or rising margins, I think that's generally quite an assuring sign that there is some kind of competitive advantage that the business is enjoying, and I see that in Asia for next year.
Okay, it's predominantly a non-Chinese and non-Asian business then. Everyone asks about the Chinese and Asian business because of Belisco and where they're based. But it's predominantly a North American and European market. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
And excluding GM and Ford, they're not taking share. So you're almost relying on 2 vendors to carry most of their growth and most of their value growth.
Well, so first of all, when you say it's not predominantly a Chinese or an Asian business, I think 45% of operating profit contribution is is basically Asia now, right? If not 45 and 40. So it's, you know, it is very large. And most of the incremental value, because the margins are higher in Asia, and because the growth rate should be higher, most of the incremental value will come from that space. So I think it's not...
They won't stay that high, though, will it? So Asian margins are disproportionately high, and in any other auto market they come down as unit growth slows.
Possible, but I think you have to ask why the margins are disproportionately high in Asia. The reason, you know, as I understand it, is because a lot of the R&D has already been done, and, you know, there are prototypes that are simply leveraged, right? So you don't have to recreate the R&D from the US. You simply kind of customize the product a little bit and you shove it in. And if you look at what's actually been happening to margins over the past, you know, 2 or 3 years, you know, auto growth has been slowing in China, right? The margins haven't been coming down for next year in China. So, yeah, sure, I think over some very long-term horizon, we should expect convergence to a kind of, you know, global average, but I suspect that's a 20-year horizon and not a 2-year horizon. And I think the data backs that up. But...
how do you value it? May I ask, how do you
Yeah.
I mean, optically it looks incredibly attractive. Great returns, stable margins, plugged into, you know, many end vendors in China that everyone wants to talk about.
Yeah.
But it's on, you know, long times and 10 times. How do you rationalize what you should pay for it?
Okay, so I tend to kind of start with simpler techniques first and then kind of, you know, get to more complex stuff. And so historically, you know, it's been closer to 15 or a high teens multiple. So that's a starting anchor. You can debate whether it's worth that as a kind of secondary stage, but that's the starting point. I think one very easy back of the envelope way to think about it is, you know, if you kind of just do a basic calculation of, you know, FCF growth plus FCF yield, you know, at current valuation, what does that give you, and how does that compare to a market rate of return? And I suspect that you'll have a mid to high single-digit FCF, probably closer to a mid single-digit FCF growth rate long term, and then at 10 times or 11 times earnings, you'll probably get a, you know, at least a 6% yield. They do convert most of their earnings to free cash, and so you combine those two together, you get about an 11%, you know, yield plus growth, and that's equal to a long-term market rate of return. So, you know, very back of the envelope, this is not an official kind of Eastspring valuation methodology, but very back of the envelope, that kind of looks attractive because it's well above average business in terms of, you know, ROE management, operational as well as capital allocation quality. To get that at a market rate of return is attractive. At Eastspring, we build out a model that has, you know, a more complex way of looking at this. So we use 3 absolute return methodologies and 3 kind of relative upside methodologies. The absolute return ones are DCF, RI, and BDM, and then the relative ones are multiple base. And so we tend to kind of triangulate between those. You know, the first batch will give you a kind of fair or intrinsic value, and the second will inform you as to, you know, what the market is likely to pay based on either peers or history or whatever. And I find if you put those together, you get to a multiple that looks like it's, you know, 15 times plus, you know, versus the current, you know, 10, 11, 12. So that's how I think about valuation. And I think it comes at a relatively low risk as well. So, you know, it's not the highest upside idea I have at the moment, but it is one where I think the long-term risk of, you know, permanent impairment of capital is pretty modest.
Thanks, Rob. That's probably enough on next here. You talked about UMC and coal as some interesting, maybe contrarian views from the last interview. Are there any other stocks or parts of the global supply chain you'd like to talk about where you've got a different view from the market?
Yeah, a couple. So Chinese property is probably a thought-provoking one where my view is, I think, quite different from at least the buy side, as reflected in valuation. I don't know how familiar you guys are with it, but, you know, 20-second pitch is that if you look at the historical fundamentals of the sector, you'll basically see that, you know, profitability as measured on ROE or any other metric is double that of the market. Growth has been double that of the market, and valuation is half of that of the market. So that's kind of an intriguing starting point when you can kind of buy a business that does 20-30% ROEs, 20% growth, and it costs 5 times earnings. What's the kind of differential or contrarian point of view there? So there are a number of things the market is worried about, and you see that in discussions with other buy-side investors, and you see that with some of the research the sell-side puts out. Generally people doubt whether the growth rate and the profitability is sustainable, and I've done a lot of work in terms of both top-line growth as well as the margin sustainability, and I feel that top-line growth will be a lot lower in future than it has in the past. Profitability will probably be largely intact, and you can justify that both by looking at unit economics of available projects in China at the moment, as well as by economics of property developer peers operating in similar markets in Asia. And I guess most people tend to have a kind of, especially quality investors, they tend to almost apply a quality discount to the property names. And I would argue that if you look at the actual behavior in terms of corporate governance, capital allocation, any other objective metric, the property companies probably, the developers in China probably deserve a premium on grounds of corporate governance to the rest of the Chinese market and probably the Asian market as a whole. So that's a big overview of, I guess, the contrarian view that I have on the sector. I'm happy to speak in more detail.
Have you looked in particular at the accounting for some of these property companies, and are there any practices you've detected that might suggest shenanigans?
And we've retained like 2 guys to do like a forensic examination of the accounts. So look, the biggest thing is that they have a lot of hidden debt in terms of JV projects, and they kind of massage the economics in terms of they acquire a plot of land or a half-built project, and they don't fully consolidate it, even though they have effective control. And they class the minority participant, or they class the other participant as having equity, whereas in fact they actually have like fixed obligations to them, and the equity is entirely the company. So how do you deal with that? One way of dealing with it is by looking for companies that don't do a lot of these JVs. And you do have disclosure of the project, and the companies will tell you how frequently they do JVs. And there's a number of large companies in China, so China Overseas Land as well as China Vanke, that are not very big on those type of projects, and therefore don't have that prospect for abuse. I think the other thing to know from an accounting point of view is that all the real estate developers in China have an unusual method of revenue recognition, so they recognize a bullet, right, at handover rather than percentage of completion. And as a result, like all your GAAP financials are effectively lagged, and you're printing numbers that really reflect operating decisions and performance that's 1 or 2 years old. So GAAP financials old and also kind of subject to substantial potential for abuse because of the arbitrary nature of how you can release costs into the gross margin. So they capitalize interest as well as capitalizing a bunch of other things. And the way you're supposed to do it is you're supposed to kind of ring fence it at a project level, but everyone knows that it's not properly ring fenced, and they manipulate the margins. Not systematically in any one direction or another, but they do manipulate the margins for margin stability. So, it is a case where the financials are not fully representative of the business, but it's kind of a question of, well, so what does that mean? So how seriously does it distort the economics of the business? And, what kind of discount should we apply? And I think for the larger, better-run companies that trade at 5, 6, 7 times earnings, I'm willing to put up with a little bit of smoothing and massaging of margins to get what I consider to be still a great business. So those are just 2 things that we're familiar with in terms of shenanigans.
Do you look at the biggest or one of the largest problems with valuing a property company often just comes about from the price to NAV calculation, because the land banks and indeed projects are well known, well discounted. There's lots of people inside those the published projects.
Yeah.
And effectively, you're only betting on discount rates, really, if you're looking at land bank rather than the actual accounting that produce the value. So how do you if that's not fair, or please tell me, but if it is fair, how do you try and not just bet your entire investment thesis on a discount rate or one interest rate, given you probably don't have more knowledge than particularly analysts that cover that stock?
Well, I mean, look, so one starting point is by actually looking at, either an earnings or an adjusted free cash flow number. And so if you adjust for the fact that, basically growth capex shows up within a change in inventories, so it's, miscategorized by accounting terms, these things will throw off a lot of free cash, and so you can value the free cash. Then the discussion as to, how useful the actual NAVs are, especially the project level ones, take it with a grain of salt. I mean, I think that there's so much room for arbitrary assumptions there. I try to look at what the actual kind of, GAAP book value is. And when you get deep discounts to that, then that already suggests that the business is quite attractive. I mean, if you can buy things at 0.6, 0.7 times book, and that book generates a 20% ROE, that's kind of high-level indicative of mispricing. I take your point that you can get to any kind of NAV number you want based on the discount rates. I guess for our purposes of valuation, I don't see that as very different from the problem we face for the rest of the stocks that we look at, because we run a residual income or a DCF model, which of course is highly sensitive to a discount rate on pretty much every stock that we look at. So, perhaps I'm missing some of the substance of your concern, but to me it doesn't seem like a structurally different valuation problem that we face every day.
If you have a discount rate that is, highly subjective, then you go to the hard tangibles, which are, one's economic profitability, and we know that they make them up or smooth them, and so you're getting the extent to which they're smoothing them in any 1 or 2 years. That's my concern. It's hard to get a proper valuation either way. Can I just come back with a different?
Sure.
I don't want to go on a circular.
Sure.
It's a sector that's riddled with government intervention. So, that's just a characteristic of it.
Sure.
How do you incorporate that into your analysis?
Well, okay, so let's talk about what that government intervention is, right? So there's a bit of a kind of start-stop housing cycle that's been getting shorter in terms of periodicity and, a little bit kind of smaller in amplitude. So, the government kind of meddles with money supply and with overall kind of, macroprudential measures that affect the property market. I don't think that there's systematic meddling in terms of choosing winners or, launching lots of new SOEs or kind of intervening in market share gains and losses. So I think it's, it's subject to macroeconomic tampering in much the same way as the autos industry in China and many other industries in China. How do I incorporate that into valuation? Well, look, you can do it in several ways. I'm not a big proponent of this, but some people want to use a kind of a beta-adjusted cost of capital or discount rate, and we've tested that just to kind of test for whether all the mispricing was simply due to just not incorporating beta. I'm not a big fan of looking at beta-adjusted numbers myself. I think this will answer your earlier question about how do you incorporate the smoothing and so on. I'm happy to look at longer-term economics of what these businesses have done, because I think by definition you can smooth, but a 5-year average of many smooth numbers is likely to be an accurate 5-year average. And similarly, we can look at project economics, on a spot basis in terms of acquisition costs of land, build costs, and spot prices for ASPs, and those, I guess, are inputs into what I think about as normalized profitability. So I think history is informative, and I think that we can look at normal project economics, and I think those are informative and supportive of what I think about profitability.
Could you maybe talk about when you've made investments in the past that have gone wrong? What categories of mistakes you would say that there are, that you've made, and how you try to avoid falling into them again?
Sure. So I think when thinking back at the mistakes that I've made over the past 3 years, possibly because of the valuation skew that we have, they've probably been skewed towards cigar butts and I guess bags of cash, to simplify, that never kind of re-rated to what their intrinsic value is. I think an interesting and quite an illustrative one is a medium-sized company by the name of FIH Mobile. So I think that's 1 or 2B. When I first looked at the stock about a year or a year and a half ago, you could see that almost all of market cap was accounted for by the cash they had in the bank. It's a subsidiary of Foxconn, so it's kind of Terry Go's company. So it's a part of a well-run and relatively honest conglomerate that is unlikely to simply steal that cash from you and from minority shareholders. It has a real operating business, so it basically supplies smartphone casing and assembly services, not to Apple, but to basically most other people in the market. And so the way you could look at it is that almost all of market cap was in cash, and then even if you kind of discounted that cash to nothing, it was still generating a 10 to 15% free cash flow yield. And that yield was based on their economics over 7 years, as well as the prospects for economics in the future. So valuation was extremely attractive. The quality of the business was about kind of average, maybe slightly above average. I think it had 15% ROIC. But so how did this go wrong? So the way it went wrong is the company embarked on basically a project to resuscitate and revive the Nokia smartphone brand, throwing a lot of money at a business that may or may not work. So it's not exactly theft, but I mean the cash is now burning at a rate of 10%, 15% a year, and there's not really much evidence that the whole Nokia project is working. Remains to be seen whether they shut that down and whether the stock rebounds, but I think meanwhile the stock is down 40-50%, and so you can always go below the entire market cap being accounted for by cash. And I guess that was what were the mistakes there. I think mistakes were, being a little bit overconfident in the extremity of the valuation, and I guess the general honesty of the management team. So valuation was extreme, and management still hasn't stolen the money, but they did embark on a project that basically is black box economics, and that has, I think, scared pretty much all stocks I've covered away from the stock, which creates a bit of a vicious cycle. And jury's still out. We still own a little bit of this, and maybe on a 5-year view we'll kind of break even, but clearly I think a mistake so far. And a few other kind of names that I can talk about, but generally sins of commission are related to buying cigar butts in Asia without kind of thinking through what's happening at the business operations level thoroughly enough, and without kind of keeping enough track. Because I tend to also think about investments on a 3 to 5 year horizon, and I think I probably was not aggressive enough in reevaluating whether the thesis is on track in the case of FIH Mobile after they bought the Nokia assets and after the first and second quarter and of misses and after the 5th profit warning that they put through. So a little bit of complacency.
And that's obviously something that, as investors who like value, it's a common pitfall to fall into, the so-called value trap.
Yeah.
Are there what are the ways in which you've developed to try and stop yourself from doing that, or to identify companies that might turn out to be value traps?
Well, I think a starting point is that if I look at something that has extreme valuation, I also insist that it has very good capital allocation and honest management, especially here in Asia, because that's the number one way in which you can go wrong. I mean, the cash can just be stolen from you. And truth be told, this business did kind of tick both of those boxes, and the management was quite honest. There was no history of theft, and they had a real operating business, and that operating business did not look like it was going to go away. So I think beyond kind of insisting on having that quality checklist, I think that the next and most important thing to do, and the thing that I failed to do, was kind of track the thesis aggressively and see whether things are changing, because starting the Nokia project that's going to burn cash at 10 to 15% of cash balance per year was not part of the thesis, and I think I kind of let that slide as forgivable if you have like so much cash, right? clearly was not forgivable by the rest of the market.
Thanks.
Thanks, Arthur. Maybe in the last few minutes, do you want to talk about why you moved to Somerset? What the attractions of your current post are, and
Sure.
What you're looking for?
Yeah, sure. So some great things about my current position include the people that I work with, investment process that I can work within, although it's a bit more value skewed, and just generally an environment where you feel that you are contributing to the final product, both through the research as well as through the portfolio management side. I guess the downside, and I think what could be better at Somerset would be, first of all, a better alignment with the kind of long-term, I guess, business strategy and ownership of the firm. And what I mean by that is that being part of a listed vehicle, and so we're a subsidiary of Prudential PLC, there are a lot of investment decisions made at our firm that are not investment team driven, and there's a lot of kind of hanging on and general noise and disturbance that's caused by people that are not investors. And I guess the practical danger is that although we have a great process, we have a great team, very well aligned to most of them, that team can be taken apart after 2 to 3 years of underperformance. It's not something we face now, but it is something that can change. And so I think I'd like to work at a place that has more kind of ballast, a kind of firmer commitment, and where you know that if you work there, you're buying into the investment philosophy and the investment process, and you know that there's no way that will change. Or, at least it's not going to be turned upside down, or evolve perhaps. And I feel that's something I don't have at Eastspring, and that's something that I might have at a firm that is similar to Somerset in terms of ownership and, I guess, business management. What are other bits that are attractive about Somerset? I think we've talked about the differences between these kind of rebounders and compounders. I mean, I'd probably appreciate a bit more latitude to look at higher quality businesses that don't have such a strong kind of behavioral pricing signal. And so I think that would it would play to my strength as an investor, and I think it would kind of allow me to generate higher returns, and that flows through the firm's success and individual success. And so I do feel a little bit tied down at my current role. So those would be the two major things for me. So basically better alignment with the long-term ownership and management of the firm, and then also a little bit more liberty to look at compounders and to exercise my discretion, subject to the results, but I think based on my hit rate of picking compounders historically, that would be additive and not detractive to my investments.
Thanks, Arthur. And any other questions for us?
Yeah, I mean, maybe at this stage, given the people in the room, I'd love to hear more about, how your process differs from mine. I think we both feel that alignment of investment philosophy and process is absolutely critical to get a good fit here. Could you kind of talk about, what you see as maybe just the weaknesses of how we're not aligned, or, potential problems that you might perceive?
I've got views for it.
Yeah, I think so. Our process, just within certainly those stock types we talked about, try to capture both compounders and rebounders. So we want to be open to both, with the idea that any whole is a composite of opposites. And I think our best stocks have been compounders actually, and they've delivered the strongest return, and we have the greatest confidence looking at them, and sort of slightly prefer the rifle shot, competitive advantage, stroke consolidated industry approach, in which you can really zoom in and do a lot of work on an individual company. I think we have been less good, albeit within a value-trapped market in which value is the same, has done value, at getting rebounders, or many of those that we have been compounding companies which have fallen off drastically when we bought into them.
Right.
But we're very much still open to both sides. So I think what you would add is perhaps a bit more experience and focus on that part from our point of view. That would be helpful, having a good focus on that. And then for you, exactly as you say, I think you can benefit from A lot of the work we do here, finding the compounders, and
Yeah.
as far as I'm concerned, at this point in the market, we could be wrong, but there is the possibility that a slight tilt in the
Yeah.
type of company,
Yeah.
either through industry or startup access to startup perform, which I would be keen to level up our rebound skill. In terms of the process from idea generation through to inclusion in the portfolio, I don't have quite as good a sense as to what yours is, but there's certainly along the way there's quite a lot of team feedback into each idea. So the junior analysts have to write a two-pager which can get shot down quite early by their mentors or the team members. So there's oversight there, and then we're about to have the Tuesday morning investment meeting. We've ready, all of us, with the notes, and Royal Sherman is going to get multiple questions, which is useful, obviously. And then there's an additional hurdle in that there are team units around each fund who also do an additional meeting, and they'll discuss whether it's not one at any price, one for the body physical, one now. So there's quite good, I think, team feedback effects. That's a better word.
We have something about weaker countries or regions done the geographical.
No, I couldn't believe we haven't done a geographical tour of the houses.
Can I just check? I'm an Asian journalist.
Right.
There are countries and sectors that I prefer to do, although I wouldn't, openly admit them to clients. Where do you least like to dig in terms of countries or subsectors? Both from a historical perspective, lack of success or lack of opportunities, but also maybe where your skill sets might not be as high as where they might be in another subsector or country.
That's a good question. I think that India, I would have to freely admit, is being a place that I have not spent a lot of time in terms of my stock research. The few ideas I have had there have been successful, but it's not a space that I know particularly well, and I can imagine that there are many people who know that much better than I do. I think beyond that, I kind of almost have a policy of not buying kind of rebounders or privately held companies that are very cheap in China, because I have gotten that wrong so many times. So within the Chinese space, definitely more biased toward very high quality franchises, preferably privately held, but open to some SOEs as well. I think those would be the kind of clearest ones. So weak on India and not interested in kind of buying cigar butts in China. Beyond that, we manage a fairly large amount of money, and so it's hard to kind of invest in a lot of the kind of smaller names here in ASEAN in particular. And I think that necessarily biases you a little bit more towards North Asia, so that's where a lot of the experience has been. But had success with smaller names in Indonesia as well as Thailand, as well as plenty in Taiwan. So I would say that, look, India tough for me. Chinese cigar butts tough. I think Korean conglomerates, and I think there's like a whole spectrum of these kind of low ROE, often state-owned or state-influenced companies like KEPCO and the shipyards and everyone else in Korea that I just do not excel at picking the stocks within, even despite the fact that they go through kind of cyclical adjustments, and not very interested in spending a great deal of time doing that, except within quite narrow areas where I do have a bit of an edge. So those are, sorry, I didn't kind of prepare a detailed answer, but those are some thoughts in terms of what my weaknesses might be, or some areas where I think I have limitations. The rest of Asia is pretty kind of comfortable with. On a daily basis.
How many Taiwanese stocks have you written on? How many Taiwanese stocks have you written, published on in the last year, or maybe 18 months?
I've only published a final report on 4. Done work on a lot more than that because there are competitors to them and so on. But
which 4, please?
Okay, so Catcher, Case Tech, Eclat Textile, and there was another, not Shinzo Textile, there was another textile company. It's an Eclat lookalike. Sorry, the name escapes me.
Macalot?
Yeah, it probably is. So it didn't go anywhere.
Macalot. It's doing quite well at the moment. But sorry, just to jump back, what are your thoughts on the apparel, clothing, textile type of the supply chain? Because that seems to be in flux at the moment. If you've written on it, that would be interested to know.
Okay, so my thoughts on that, go quite far back in that I think the first thing I did as an investment analyst in 2007 was with a bunch of textile companies. I think that there are very few of them that have any real kind of long-term sustainable advantage, and so that's why I kind of balked at these valuations that Macalot and Eclat got. I think with Eclat at least that's deflated a little bit. So look, I think the long term is that more and more of the labor-intensive stuff moves to Vietnam. And you see that with kind of Shenzhou, and you see that with, there's a nice little company that I like to trade, PA, which is called Texhome, which is operationally one of the best kind of integrated textile companies. It goes through huge cycles, but has a nice kind of long-term secular growth trend because they just run better and allocate their capital better than others. So your question was, well, what are my thoughts on the overall sector? I think that it moves to Vietnam. The people that currently have an advantage or have moved first to Vietnam probably have an advantage for at least another 2, 3, 4 years because it takes a while to stabilize operations once you enter that country. I think that there are people who kind of do slightly specialty fabrics, including Eclat and so on, that are going to continue earning attractive returns for a few years, but in the long run that gets entirely commoditized. I don't think that Nike and others will continue to support margins and returns at those levels. And I think that you have kind of continuing pressure of nearshoring. So, there's that new kind of semi-automated factory that Nike has in Mexico and a few other trials that are going on in the US. So, it remains a commodity business where you might have kind of, modes where you can earn excess returns for 3 to 5 years at best. And I think the way to play that industry, I'm much more comfortable kind of playing it in a cyclical way than trying to buy these secular growers because I think there are very few companies that can sustain excess returns. So if you pull the long-term kind of ROE charts and price charts of Texhome, so 2678 HK, that's kind of almost a poster child of the type of textile stock that I would like to participate in making money from.
Thanks. Any questions? No, missed. I'll go after that.
So I do. If you have a few minutes, I think.
Yeah.
I guess one thing that's been bouncing around my head is that I know that you guys have, quite a distinctive culture with most people having grown up within Somerset, and I think that's great for firm culture and continuity, and that's one of the attractions. I think there are a couple of you guys, Anthony, if I'm not mistaken, that kind of have a background outside of Somerset, so I wanted to kind of hear how that settling in has gone for you, and how big of a challenge you envision that being for other new joiners.
The settling in process, might be slightly different in that we're a much larger firm than we were when I started.
Okay.
So I've been here 5 years.
Right.
And joined Somerset in its 5th year.
Mm-hmm.
We're doing this last 11.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So, one's impact on the smaller bunch of people that I had is probably more sensitive than it might be for you joining a much bigger team.
Yeah.
So, message one, it's easier.
Yeah.
The second one is, we're still not enormous. We're not Eastspring.
Yeah.
We're not, we're not JP Morgan Asset Management. So we do have to get on in terms of shared ways of thinking.
Right.
Not identical people, but you have to not come to work and argue about how you pick stocks.
Yeah.
So that's something that you could be comfortable with and me could be comfortable with. I don't know about East Spring, but other big firms have multi-boutique asset management models, and that's not the case here, right?
Yeah,
We
of
are
course.
one
Yeah.
single unit, and the institutional focus is that. There's also no big fixed income book to pay the bills if we go wrong. So that is also very different.
Yeah.
So, in short, it's easy for you. I'm jealous. Secondly, it's great working somewhere where you only have one focus as opposed to many, and you don't have to worry about listed results. So, it's clearly an upgrade in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay. So
Chris, you joined quite recently, in winter.
Yes, I joined 2 years ago,
Okay.
and I would say, having worked at a very large organisation before, the nice thing about Somerset is that it's a small enough team that you can get to know everyone pretty quickly.
Right.
And people do make a real effort to integrate new joiners not only into the investment process but into the culture of the firm.
Yeah.
It's difficult to talk about that without turning it into a cliche, but it is a nice place to work, and people will make a big effort when someone new joins to make sure that they feel welcome. That's certainly how I felt.
And what about just like the interaction between Singapore and London? I mean, I guess especially for Anthony, right? Like, how much work do you actually do with anyone in London?
Well, this VC runs hot, so it's always on.
Okay. Right.
So, look, I used to speak more to Tuan when I sat next to him than I do now.
Right.
But I could still speak to him, most days.
Yeah.
It's just he's in the afternoon, I'm in the morning.
Right.
It's probably easier to get the ear of the portfolio managers in London than it is from Singapore, just because they just sit next to them.
Yeah.
But that means you've just got to be a bit more front foot. So if you're driven and you've got lots of great ideas, then that's for you to do.
Right.
You won't bump into them on the way to the loo. That's the shortcoming about Singapore. But
All the upside.
All the upsides. But otherwise, no. I mean, there's no. It feels very much like one office, one firm. It's not not St George or in Singapore.
I was there, but we didn't have a VC, and it was just two of us. So it was sort of, we had the spider phone on the desk and sort of feet up, swimming trunks on, and it was a little bit more disconnected. But it's the volume of communication has picked up a huge amount since, and even then it was a very good sort of constructive sort of relationship between the two offices, and what's useful being live in Asia is you can quickly give the London office the sort of the latest what's been going on, so there's a natural flow there.
I would agree. Part of the reason I enjoy being based here. It's just more conducive to my investment process. Great. Well, so look, I think there are many things I'd like to learn more about your process, but I'm conscious that you have a meeting coming up, so I just don't want to drag this out forever either. I think that from my point of view, I continue to be of the belief that there's a lot of overlap in terms of how we approach stock picking on a one-on-one basis, and I'm keen to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Simon. That would be great. We'll collate the views here, but definitely be one of the strongest candidates so far. So we're interested at this end, and the upside in that type of a partnership is you need everyone to meet you. It's going to still a couple of different things to turn. But let's keep this going.
Great.
Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah. Right. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Take care. All the best.
You too.
Bye. Let's leave this.
Let's leave it on, shall we? We'll do it.
Yeah.
All right.
No worries. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, done. I think you guys have another meeting starting in this, so. Thank you very much. Thanks for the conversation. Learned a lot from you and learned a lot from them. Glad I came over.
No, I think it went on a lot longer than I was thinking.
Yeah, I know, right. Feel a bit guilty about stretching it out.
No,
They seem quite engaged.
Sorry, I
so
mean, I
that's a
think
good
there's been
sign.
some, no, good, that's great. No, it's perfect.
Good to have some surprises in life. Okay, all right.
Thanks for
Take care.
coming.
Well,
And we'll see you.
keep in touch. Cheers.
Bye then.
See you.